So, uh, think about the last time you went to the doctor for a physical. Like, they check
Hmm.
your vitals, right? Blood pressure, heart rate.
Yeah, maybe they draw some blood or, take an X-ray. It's very routine.
Right, exactly. It's highly specific. And usually, there is this expectation of precision. Like, you look at the x-ray, you see the jagged white line of a bone, and the doctor points to it and says, there is the problem. It's visible. It's confined to one body on one specific Tuesday afternoon.
And that provides a real sense of certainty. I mean, human beings naturally gravitate toward that. We
Yeah.
want complex systems to be easily categorizable, right? Broken or unbroken, healthy or sick.
But imagine trying to take the vital signs, the x-rays, the blood pressure of not just one person, but billions of people simultaneously. And imagine you aren't just taking those vitals once, but tracking them every single day, year after year, for over 60 years.
Right, suddenly you aren't looking at a clean X-ray anymore.
No, not at all. You're looking at a landscape that is incredibly vast, deeply complex, and just full of contradictions.
Because you're moving from a simple biological diagnosis into the realm of macroeconomic and societal evolution. And when you look at data on that scale, the muddy waters are really where the actual story lives.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we're wading into today. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack a truly monumental stack of data. I mean, we have this massive repository of historical metrics stretching from 1960 all the way to 2022.
It's a massive time frame.
It really is. And the patient we are diagnosing, it's a group of nations categorized as the members of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development,
Huh.
or the IBRD for short.
And before we go any further, it is crucial that you, as the listener, understand exactly who we are talking about when we say IBRD countries.
Yeah, let's clarify that.
Because the IBRD is essentially a global cooperative. When we analyze this specific data pool, we are looking specifically at middle-income and creditworthy developing nations.
Okay, so to be clear, we aren't talking about the wealthiest, fully industrialized legacy economies, like places that built their wealth over the last 2 centuries.
Correct. Nor are we looking at the poorest, most fragile states. We are analyzing the global middle class, essentially. These are the transitional economies, the nations that have been undergoing rapid, aggressive modernization over the last half century.
Right.
They are the ones actually doing the heavy lifting of global transformation right now.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the core logic of the data we are looking at today reveals this 60-year tug of war.
Yeah.
On one side, you have this relentless, almost gravitational push for economic growth and efficiency.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have the vital need for human capital, meaning the health and education of the people actually driving that growth.
And looming over all of this, casting a very long shadow, is the ticking clock of an aging population, paired with an incredibly urgent, incredibly friction-heavy push for environmental sustainability.
It is a profound balancing act. I mean, the data makes it overwhelmingly clear that you cannot adjust one of those variables without sending shockwaves through all the others.
Right. If you push the growth lever, you inherently pull the environmental lever. If you pull the education lever, you inherently change the demographic timeline. It's all connected.
To give you a mental image of how deeply connected this all is, the cover page of the report we pulled this data from is actually really striking. It's just a completely clean, white background. And right in the center, there is a globally connected line icon, just this web of geometric nodes linking together.
It's a very fitting visual.
It really perfectly symbolizes what we were about to discuss.
Yeah.
The undeniable interconnectedness of these transitioning economies. Like, you can't isolate their agriculture from their education or their energy use from their life expectancy. They're moving as a single massive organism.
And that visual is the perfect starting point. Because to understand the organism, to understand the billions of people living within these transitioning nations, we first have to look at the ground they are standing on. We have to look at the economic engine that was built beneath them over the last 6 decades.
And the sheer scale of that engine is where we have to begin. Like the transition from purely trying to expand to chasing high-quality growth. I want to talk about GDP, but specifically the way this data measures it, because it caught my eye.
The PPP metric.
Yeah, exactly. We are looking at purchasing power parity, or PPP. So looking at the chart, in 1990, The total GDP for these IBRD countries was roughly 10.32 trillion international dollars.
Which, just to provide context, was a massive sum by any historical standard up to that point. It represented a huge acceleration from the 1960s.
Right, but then you follow the line to 2022, that number skyrocketed to 91.0 trillion international dollars.
A nearly nine-fold increase.
Almost 9 times larger in just over 30 years. I mean, the data visualizes this with a massive upward arrow, indicating a nearly 79.5% total growth surge in the underlying metric frameworks over just the most recent eras. But before we talk about what that money bought, can you explain the purchasing power parity part? Because if you just convert currencies using exchange rates, it doesn't always reflect reality on the ground, does it?
No, that is an essential distinction to make. If we only looked at raw exchange rates, the data would be skewed by global currency markets, inflation, and financial speculation.
All right, it would just be noise.
Exactly.
Right.
Purchasing power parity adjusts for the relative cost of local goods. It essentially asks, how many loaves of bread or haircuts or concrete blocks can a person actually buy in their own country with their local currency?
So it's a measure of actual lived wealth.
Yes. It means this $91 trillion figure isn't just an illusion created by central banks tweaking interest rates. It represents a massive, tangible explosion in the real economic output and the actual purchasing capability of billions of people. It is real wealth creation.
Wow. But looking at the chart, that relentless climb to 91 trillion isn't a perfectly smooth line. There is a very specific anomaly here.
The 2020 dip.
Yeah, the data explicitly circles the year 2020. You see this sharp, undeniable dip from 2019's high of roughly 76.57 trillion, pulling down before it recovers and shoots back up toward that 91 trillion mark. And, well, obviously we all know what happened in 2020, the global pandemic.
It acts as a massive biological shock to an economic system.
Right.
The reason that 2020 anomaly is so critical to highlight in the data is that it exposes a moment of profound vulnerability in an otherwise unstoppable upward trajectory. When global supply chains froze and populations locked down, that ninefold engine sputtered.
Yeah.
It proved that no matter how massive the macroeconomic numbers get, they remain fundamentally tethered to human biology and global logistics.
It's a terrifying realization when you think about it. But the part of the data that really made me stop and reread the numbers isn't the GDP growth itself. It's what was happening underneath the hood of that growth.
You're talking about page 3.
Yes, page 3. Let's talk about savings and infrastructure, because I'm genuinely confused by the math here.
You're referring to the divergence between net national savings and gross capital formation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at this data, and it says that net national savings, meaning the percentage of gross national income that these countries are actually putting away in the bank, peaked around 2010 at just over 20%, like 20.57%, to be exact.
Right.
So they were saving a fifth of their income. Great. But by 2020, that savings rate had dropped down to roughly 13.33%. So savings are falling significantly.
Correct.
But in the exact same time frame, gross capital formation just absolutely ballooned. It went from a relatively modest $76.56 billion back in 1960 to a mind-bending $13.25 trillion by 2021.
It looks like a contradiction, I know.
It looks mathematically impossible. Like, if I am running a household or a business and my savings account is shrinking from 20% down to 13%, I can't suddenly afford to build a $10 million mansion.
No, you can't.
So how can a collection of nations experience a massive drop in their savings rate while simultaneously spending trillions of dollars building infrastructure? Where is the money coming from if they aren't saving it?
It's a brilliant question, and it gets to the very heart of how a transitional economy matures. To understand this, we have to decouple the idea of national savings from a regular household checking account.
Yeah.
When we see the savings rate drop from 20.57% down to 13.33%, what we are actually witnessing is a structural shift in consumption.
Meaning they are spending their paychecks instead of stuffing them in a mattress.
Precisely. In the earlier decades of this data, populations in these developing nations were essentially engaged in survival saving.
Right.
There were very few social safety nets, so you saved everything you could. But as that $91 trillion GDP engine revved up and these nations grew richer, their populations fundamentally changed their behavior. They transitioned into consumer-driven economies.
So they started buying things.
Oh, yes. They started buying cars, washing machines, entertainment, and healthcare services. That naturally drives the savings rate down as a percentage of total income because a massive consumer class has been born.
Okay, so they are out at the malls and buying cars. But that still doesn't explain the $13.25 trillion in gross capital formation. Like, who is paying for the roads those new cars are driving on?
Gross capital formation isn't just funded by everyday citizens putting money in a local savings bank. It is the aggregate of state-driven debt, corporate reinvestment, and massive injections of foreign direct investment.
Ah, foreign money.
Yes. When an economy shows the kind of growth we saw in the GDP data, it attracts global capital. Investors worldwide say, look at the growth in that IBRD nation. I want to finance their new deepwater port or their new power grid because the returns will be massive.
So capital formation is basically the physical manifestation of all that wealth and investment.
Exactly. It isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It represents the pouring of concrete. It is the new highways, the suspension bridges, the airports, and the digital infrastructure, like the thousands of miles of fiber optic cables.
Right.
They were taking the wealth generated by that GDP growth, combining it with global financing, and physically assembling a modern world.
So we have this massive economic engine, and we have the physical infrastructure of a modern society springing up from the dirt. But an economic infrastructure doesn't just build itself, and it certainly doesn't run itself.
No, it requires labor.
You need a labor force. You need people.
Yeah.
And this brings us to a massive structural shift in the data, because the labor pool in these countries is fundamentally changing shape.
The structural displacement of the dependency ratio. If you want to understand the future of these nations, this is perhaps the most profound, slow-moving tectonic shift in the entire data set.
Let's visualize this for a second, because dependency ratio sounds like an accounting term, but it's incredibly human.
It is very human.
Imagine an elevator with 10 people in it. The dependency ratio is basically asking how many of those 10 people are actively working and paying the bills, and how many are dependents, meaning children who are too young to work or elderly people who have retired. The working adults have to support the dependents.
And in the 1960s, that elevator looked very, very specific.
Right. If you look at the data from 1966, the youth dependency ratio in these IBRD countries was an astronomical 73.16%.
Which is staggering.
Think about that. For every 100 working-age adults, there were roughly 73 children. It is an incredibly bottom-heavy demographic pyramid.
The societal pressure of that ratio is immense. The primary burden on the working generation at that time was sheer childcare, basic nourishment, and building enough elementary schools to house a massive generation of kids.
But then you track that line forward over 60 years. By 2022, that youth dependency ratio plummets from 73.16% down to 35.69%.
A massive drop.
They essentially halved the relative burden of youth dependency. But, and here's the other side of the seesaw, the old age dependency ratio went the exact opposite direction.
Yes, it did.
Back in 1960, it was a mere 6.97%. Barely anyone was making it to old age, relatively speaking. But by 2022, it had steadily climbed to 15.21%. It more than doubled.
And the data emphasizes this with a bold red arrow marking the doubling trend, specifically circling the post-2010 era.
Why post-2010? Why that specific year?
Because that is the inflection point where the aging acceleration truly kicked in. The massive generation of children from the 1960s, the ones who made up that 73% youth dependency ratio, they became the workforce that built the $91 trillion economy.
Right.
But post-2010, that exact same generation started hitting retirement age en masse.
So we are literally watching a demographic seesaw tip in real time. The societal weight is shifting from the playground to the retirement home.
And the implications of this shift are staggering. It completely rewrites the economic playbook.
How so?
Well, when your dependency burden is youth-heavy, your infrastructure spending is forward-looking. You build schools, pediatric clinics, universities. You are investing in future workers.
That makes sense.
But when the burden rotates toward elder care, the spending fundamentally changes. Governments have to divert massive amounts of that $91 trillion GDP toward managing chronic adult illnesses, funding pension systems, and building geriatric care facilities.
Which is a totally different kind of economic pressure. It feels like a trap.
It is a trap in many ways.
As that red arrow keeps pointing up and that old age dependency ratio keeps climbing, who is going to sustain that massive economic engine? You have a vast percentage of the current workforce retiring, and because the youth dependency ratio halved, there are far fewer young people coming up behind them to take their place.
It is a mathematical crisis if you rely on a labor-intensive economy. If you have fewer workers and a heavier burden of retirees to support, The only way out of that demographic trap is to ensure that the young people you do have in the workforce are exponentially more productive than the generation before them.
Which means you can't have them doing manual labor. You have
Exactly.
to upgrade their brains, which is the perfect logical bridge to the next massive shift in the data. Page 5 here, upgrading the human operating system. How did these nations accumulate human capital?
They had to execute a rapid transition from basic agrarian survival skills to highly technical cognitive skill sets. They had to build a workforce capable of managing complex systems, not just swinging hammers.
And the data on this educational transformation is genuinely inspiring. The report uses these simple visual cues like icons of open books and graduation caps to track educational output over time. Let's look at adult literacy.
It's a key metric.
In 1976, the adult literacy rate was 61.2%. Let that sink in. Nearly 4 out of 10 adults in these nations could not read or write.
Right.
You cannot run a modern supply chain or program software if 40% of your staff can't read a manual.
It places a hard ceiling on what an economy can achieve.
But by 2022, that literacy rate jumped to 90.69%, nearly universal foundational literacy. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because the data shows it's not just about overall literacy, it's about who is finally getting access to that education. Let's talk about the Gender Parity Index, or GPI.
This is a critical metric for understanding the true depth of human capital accumulation. The GPI measures the ratio of female-to-male enrollment in primary and secondary education.
So in 1970, the GPI for these countries was 0.75, meaning for every 100 boys sitting in a classroom, there were only 75 girls.
Right, a quarter of the female potential was just left at home.
But by 2022, that index improved to 1.0 in Euro.
Which means female enrollment actually slightly exceeded male enrollment across these nations.
Exactly. The chart has this very distinct dotted benchmark line drawn right at the 1.0 mark, a perfect equality. And it highlights the year 2010 as the exact moment female participation in secondary education slightly surpassed males.
It's a historic crossover.
It really is. And
Yeah.
it translates directly to literacy. If you look at youth literacy today, specifically the 15 to 24 age bracket, female literacy hit 90.7% in 2022, basically reaching total parity with the male rate of 92.4%.
Now, we often frame gender parity as a social justice victory, which it undeniably is.
Of course.
But from an impartial macroeconomic perspective, what you are seeing here is the concept of human capital leapfrogging.
What does that mean in practice?
Well,
Leapfrogging.
think back to the demographic trap we just discussed. Fewer young workers having to support a massive aging population. How do you solve that?
You need more productive workers.
Right. By achieving total gender parity in education, these economies didn't just do the right thing morally. They effectively doubled their available high-skilled talent pool.
Wow.
For decades, they were trying to build an economy with half their population sidelined by structural inequality. By bringing women fully into the educational fold, they unlocked a massive reservoir of cognitive potential.
So they realized they couldn't run a $91 trillion engine on half a tank of brain power.
Precisely. It was a strict economic mandate. A fully literate, gender-equal workforce is the only way to achieve the high-productivity service economy required to survive the demographic seesaw.
But here's the thing. You can have a population with a 90% literacy rate and total gender parity, but if those highly educated workers keep getting sick or if they're in their 50s, all that investment in human capital just evaporates.
It's entirely lost, yes.
Education and economic growth are intrinsically tied to human longevity. You need the human machine to physically hold up.
Which requires a transition from individual survival to massive coordinated public health resilience.
And the data on this lifespan dividend, on page 7 here, is staggering. We're looking at overall life expectancy at birth. In 1960, the average life expectancy across these IBRD countries was just 52.4 years. People barely making it out of middle age.
Yeah.
But by 2019, it peaked at 74.2 years.
That is a gain of over 20 years.
Gaining 20 years of life expectancy. I want you to really think about that. It is like adding a whole extra act to the play of life for billions of people. Think about your own grandparents or parents.
That changes everything.
A 20-year jump completely rewires what a family looks like. It means grandparents actually live to see their grandchildren grow up. It means people can work longer, but it also means pensions have to stretch 2 decades further.
It is a profound structural alteration to the human experience. But much like the GDP data, we have to look closely at the disruptions on this chart.
Right. There is a sharp downward arrow highlighting the year 2021. Life expectancy dropped from 74.2 down to 71.97 years. Again, we are seeing the brutal footprint of the pandemic.
And we must impartially contextualize that 2021 drop. It is a sobering reminder that economic wealth and educational metrics are not impenetrable shields.
No, they aren't.
Sudden global biological shocks can still erase years of statistical progress incredibly quickly. It underscores why public health resilience cannot be passive. It has to be constantly maintained.
But the data also shows how they built that resilience in the first place on page 8.
Yeah.
How exactly did they gain those 20 years? Because it wasn't just magic.
No, it's infrastructure.
The data points to specific ground-level interventions. Let's look at early life survival. The percentage of births attended by skilled medical professionals rose from 69.3% in the year 2000 to a massive 93.53% high coverage point by 2022.
That specific metric is a proxy for the entire maturation of a healthcare system.
How so?
You cannot fake a 93.5% skilled birth attendance rate. It requires clinics, trained nurses, reliable roads to get the mother to the clinic, and a supply chain for medical equipment.
That's the whole package.
Exact.
And then you pair that with this next statistic, which absolutely blew my mind. Measles immunization. Back in 1982, only 9.6% of the population in these countries was immunized against measles. Less than 10%.
Very low.
But by 2022, that skyrocketed to 92.0%.
If we synthesize those two data points, the skilled birth attendants and the rapid rollout of immunizations, we see the exact mechanism behind the 20-year jump in life expectancy. The report uses a very deliberate phrase here. It says maternal and infant safety barriers have essentially been established.
So it's not just that adults are living better, it's that babies are actually surviving the most dangerous day of their lives, the day they're born.
Exactly. When average life expectancy is sitting at 52 years, it usually isn't because every single adult is dropping dead at age 52.
Right.
It is heavily dragged down by horrific rates of infant and maternal mortality. By establishing those safety barriers at the very beginning of life, these nations fundamentally change their public health paradigm. They move from a desperate scramble to manage infant mortality into a system capable of managing adult longevity.
Which, ironically, feeds right back into the demographic seesaw we talked about earlier. By saving the children, those children grow up to become the massive aging population of today.
Every solution creates a new, more complex challenge.
Okay, let's take a breath and recap the patient's vitals so far. We are looking at a population across these nations that is vastly richer than they were in 1960. They are significantly older, they are smarter, deeply literate, and utilizing the cognitive power of women.
Yes.
And they're living 20 years longer, surviving infancy at unprecedented rates. It sounds like an absolute, unqualified victory for humanity.
It is an unprecedented achievement, but it is entirely bound by the laws of physics.
Which brings us to the dark side of the boom, because that massive $91 trillion economic engine, the one that paid for the schools, the clinics, and the fiber optic cables.
They needed fuel.
It didn't run on good intentions. It had to be powered. And the data shows that the fuel they used has enacted a severe, potentially catastrophic cost on the planet. We have to talk about environment and energy on page 9.
This is where we analyze the intense, undeniable friction between economic growth and environmental sustainability.
The numbers here are just, well, they are sobering. We are looking at CO2 emissions. And note, this is excluding land use change, and foresters, so we're just looking at raw industrial and energy emissions. In 1970, these nations emitted 45 megatons of CO2.
Right.
By 2019, that number exploded to 25,730 megatons.
That is a 429.6% increase in carbon emissions.
Over 400%. And if you look at total greenhouse gas emissions, when you include everything else, it reached 29,541 megatons of CO2 equivalent in 2019.
It's a massive footprint.
The report visuals are very intentional here on page 10. They use these vibrant green lines to track clean energy, and these thick, dominant gray lines to track fossil fuels, creating this massive visual disparity on the page.
The contrast highlights a structural reality. An energy transition is technically occurring, but it is moving at a glacial pace compared to the urgency of the emissions.
You can see it in percentages.
Yeah.
Alternative and nuclear energy rose from 4.09% of the total mix in 1971 to 12.63% in 2015. So yes, it tripled. But fossil fuel reliance remains incredibly stubbornly high. As of 2014, it was still sitting above 80%, specifically 83.9%.
Yes.
was trying to think of a way to visualize this. It's like these nations spent 60 years building a magnificent, sprawling mansion. It has a beautiful library representing their literacy, a state-of-the-art hospital wing representing their life expectancy.
Right.
But they are powering the entire mansion by leaving the engines of 10 massive diesel trucks running in the basement. The smoke is just filling the house.
It's a vivid analogy, but to remain entirely impartial and look strictly at the data, we have to understand why those diesel trucks are in the basement.
Okay, why?
We have to break down the growth versus efficiency paradigm. There's no moral judgment passed in this specific data set. It simply presents a mathematical and thermodynamic reality.
Which is?
The rapid, unprecedented industrialization of these IBRD nations, the literal lifting of billions of people out of poverty, required an incredibly cheap, highly dense, incredibly reliable source of energy.
And historically, fossil fuels were the only thing that fit that description.
Exactly. You cannot build $13 trillion of gross capital formation. You cannot forge steel for bridges or pour millions of tons of concrete for highways and deepwater ports using just the solar panel technology of the 1980s and 90s.
Oh, I see.
The energy density required for that sheer volume of physical construction mandated fossil fuels.
So you can't just turn the diesel trucks off because they're currently powering the life support machines in that hospital wing we just built.
That is the core friction. The slow transition to 12.63% alternative energy demonstrates a clear policy intention toward decarbonization. They know the smoke is filling the house.
Right.
But that 429.6% growth in CO2 emissions reveals how unbelievably heavy this ship is to turn. You are trying to retrofit an infrastructure that was designed from the dirt up entirely around the combustion of fossil fuels without stalling the economic engine that keeps the population alive.
Which brings us to another massive physical constraint, the land itself. On page 11, if you have a population that is growing, living longer, using exponentially more energy, and facing rising environmental pressures, how in the world are these nations feeding everyone without simply bulldozing every remaining square inch of natural forest?
That is the ultimate biological bottleneck of development. Human beings require calories.
And the data reveals this massive, completely counterintuitive divergence. I actually had to read this section twice. We are looking at cereal production versus arable land per capita.
It's a fascinating chart.
Cereal production, meaning the sheer volume of grain they are harvesting, went from 347 million metric tons in 1961 to a mind-boggling 1.727 billion metric tons in 2021.
A massive explosion in food supply.
But simultaneously, the arable land per capita, meaning the actual amount of farmable dirt available per person, shrank drastically. It went from 0.27 hectares in 1961 down to just 0.154 hectares in 2021.
Nearly halving the land footprint per person.
Right. So what does this all mean? We are literally squeezing 5 times the amount of food out of roughly half the space per person. How does that work? You can't just yell at wheat to grow faster. It feels like an agricultural magic trick.
It feels like magic, but it is actually the direct application of everything we've talked about so far. This divergence proves that the massive growth in food production was not driven by sheer land expansion. They didn't just conquer 5 times more wilderness.
Wonder what drove it.
It was driven by efficiency and technology.
What kind of technology?
Chemical fertilizers, intense mechanization using tractors powered by those fossil fuels we just discussed, advanced irrigation, and high-yield, genetically optimized crop varieties.
So it all connects back to the education data. It's the human capital applied to the dirt.
Exactly. You have literate, educated agricultural scientists and farmers utilizing complex chemical and mechanical systems to manipulate biology. It is a perfect demonstration of how technological human capital ultimately steps in to solve geographic and biological limitations. They optimize the fields.
But that obsession with efficiency isn't just happening out in the wheat fields. It is happening in the factories, in the high-rises, and across international borders. Which leads us into the final major piece of this puzzle on page 12, integration and safety nets. How do these nations interact with the rest of the world, and what happens to the workers caught in the middle of this transition?
This is where we see the physical manifestation of that globally connected line icon from the report's cover.
Let's look at the trade data, because the export numbers are wild. Total goods exports for these nations exploded from just $12.5 billion back in 1960 to a staggering $9.09 trillion in 2021.
That's a phenomenal increase in global trade participation.
But the most interesting part of this data isn't just how much they are selling, it's who they are selling to.
The diversification of their trade portfolios.
Right. There is this assumption that transitioning nations are just massive, cheap factories endlessly churning out plastic goods for wealthy Western countries. But the data shows their dependence on high-income economies dropped significantly from 88.7% in 1962 down to 63.46% in 2022.
That drop is a major structural maturity indicator. It means they aren't just subservient supply lines for the legacy wealthy nations anymore. They are trading with each other. They are building internal markets.
And their internal labor markets are shifting dramatically too on page 13. Because they optimize agriculture, you need fewer people on the farms. Because factories get mechanized, you need fewer manual laborers. So where do the people go?
The service sector.
Yes, the data shows service sector employment surged. It went from 29.17% of total employment in 1991 to 47.66% in 2022. Became the main driver of job absorption.
The transition from farm to factory to desk. It is the classic arc of economic modernization. Retail, finance, healthcare, IT services, these become the engine of employment.
But, and this is a massive but, the report notes a very persistent, troubling issue within that transition. The data tracks vulnerable employment, particularly for women. And despite all the gains in literacy and GDP, vulnerable employment for women remains high, sitting stubbornly at 42.2%.
That is a crucial reality check. A 42.2% vulnerable employment rate reminds us that a transition to a service economy doesn't automatically mean everyone gets a secure office job with a 401k and health benefits.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Many of those service jobs are entirely informal. They are street vendors, domestic workers, or gig economy laborers. They lack legal protection, job security, or consistent wages.
So you have millions of people who are literate, who are living in a $91 trillion economy, but who are still incredibly economically precarious on a daily basis, which makes the final data point of this entire report on page 14 so incredibly crucial. It acts as the ultimate decentralized safety net for those exact vulnerable populations. Personal remittances.
The massive cross-border flow of cash directly into households.
This data blew me away. Personal remittances, meaning cash sent home by family members working abroad, grew from $277 million in 1975 to a colossal $490.4 billion in 2022. It rose from representing 0.5% of GDP to roughly 1.2% of GDP.
Nearly $500 billion.
And think about how that money moves. We aren't talking about massive corporate bank transfers or foreign aid negotiated by politicians. We are talking about an aunt in London sending $200 back to her sister, or a construction worker in Dubai wiring cash to his parents. It's $500 billion sent wire transfer by wire transfer.
We so often overlook the role of remittances when we focus on massive trade deals or foreign direct investment. But remittances serve as a vital informal insurance policy.
How so?
Well, when you have a 42.2% vulnerable employment rate, that remittance cash is what actually props up local consumer spending. It pays for the school fees that keep that literacy rate high. It covers the medical bills that keep that life expectancy up. It acts as a crucial stabilizing force at the micro level, bypassing government bureaucracy entirely.
It really puts a human face on the scale of global integration. It proves that the interconnected web on the cover of the report isn't just about shipping containers. It's about human families stretched across the globe, holding each other up.
It synthesizes the deeply personal reality of macroeconomic data.
Okay, we have covered a staggering amount of ground today. We've gone from the macro to the micro and back again. Let's pull all of this together on page 15. If we look at the outro, the final synthesis of this 60-year mountain of data, there are really three core takeaways that define the journey of these IBRD member nations.
First, we must acknowledge the undeniable historic achievements. We witnessed a nearly nine-fold leap in total GDP running parallel to an incredible civilization-altering victory in human literacy and gender parity in education.
Second, we have to look at the core challenges that are the direct byproduct of that very success. These nations are now caught in a vice grip. The dual pressures of a rapidly aging demographic that threatens to break their economic dependency models, and the intense, suffocating environmental pressure of a 429.6% growth in greenhouse gas emissions.
And third, the data points to the transition direction they are currently attempting to navigate. They face the agonizingly slow but mathematically necessary move from fossil fuels to clean energy, alongside the continued pivot from labor-intensive agrarian work to a high-productivity service sector capable of supporting an older population.
So the roadmap is laid out clearly in the data. but the terrain ahead is incredibly rough.
It is. The task facing these IBRD nations over the next 50 years is seemingly contradictory. They must continue to elevate the quality of their human capital, moving from just basic literacy to advanced technological innovation, while concurrently executing an aggressive, massive energy transition to meet climate goals. And they have to build this resilient, sustainable prosperity in an age defined by sudden global shocks and uncertainty.
You've seen the data now, you know the vitals. We've watched billions of people trade high birth rates and agrarian survival for long lifespans, deep literacy, and trillion-dollar service economies. But the bill has come due on the environment, and the massive workforce that built this modern world is graying rapidly. As you look at the world around you today, whether it's the price of your groceries, the energy powering your home, or the political debates on your screen, ask yourself, is the next half-century going to be about human capital inventing our way out of these environmental and demographic corners? Or will the very systems that made us rich become too heavy for the next generation to carry? Keep digging, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.